At the beginning of our movie, I'll introduce you guys to Steve and Dennis, who are best friends who work as paramedics together in New Orleans, Louisiana. Steve is a lonely bachelor who can't commit to a relationship, while Dennis married young and has 2 children who are 18 years apart. And lately, Steve and Dennis have been responding to a lot of 911 calls where people are either dead in strange circumstances or their stories don't make any sense at all. And all of these cases are linked to a new designer drug called Synchronic. And at a domestic call, they find a stabbing victim and an old sword embedded in a wall. And while Steve tends to the injured man, he's accidentally pierced by a dirty needle. And while being tested for possible infections, he discovers that he has cancer in his underdeveloped, non-calcified pineal gland. His doctor casually mentions that Steve's pineal gland is more like a teenager's, and this means that Steve is actually enlightened and has a third eye. The second call, a burn victim who's completely burned, and the third call is a bite from a venomous snake, which has never really happened in New Orleans in decades, because there aren't really a lot of snakes in Louisiana. I mean, in Louisiana, yes, but not in New Orleans. And did you guys know that people ate crocodiles in Louisiana? Anyways, Steve and Dennis report to yet another call where a Synchronic drug package was found, and this time it was a group of teenagers who took a lot of it. And among those teenagers was Dennis's 18-year-old daughter, Brianna, who is now apparently gone missing. And Steve, in a fit of rage, goes to a local head shop and buys all the Synchronic that he could find. And there he learns that they actually discontinued the production. And he's followed out of the store by a man who begs him to buy it off of him. And Steve declines the man's offer to pay triple its worth, and Steve stays firm when the man even ups his front, and he tells him that he's gonna pay him 20 times what he paid. And later that night, Steve heard some kind of disturbance coming from his living room, and he found the man from earlier in his closet. And Steve tells him to get out of the house, but the man tells him that he's the chemist that created the Synchronic drug. He then explains how he created Synchronic as a DMT-like drug using a red flower that grows in the California desert. He explains the Synchronic messes with the pineal gland, so you experience time as it actually is. And events in time are like tracks on a record, and they're technically always there. All you have to do is just drop the needle wherever you want to play. And Synchronic, he says, is the needle. And because kids' pineal glands are not yet fully developed, sometimes the drug will make them permanently time travel. And adults seem to only partially move through time like ghosts. The chemist explains to Steve that he was trying to get rid of all the drugs and that the ones that Steve brought are actually the last of his supply. And Steve tells the chemist that he flushed the Synchronic drug down the toilet, but we can see that he wasn't actually telling the truth. And during their next call, a victim of a sword fight dies, and Dennis learns that somebody has been stealing morphine, and he misinterprets Steve's poor health and constant use of painkillers as evidence that he is a morphine addict. The two of them get into an argument and fight while treating a hysterical patient, while in fact it was the driver that was stealing all the morphine. And back at home, Steve decides to take the Synchronic drug. And when he does, he's transported back to a time when New Orleans was just still a swamp. And in the span of just 7 minutes, he's attacked by both an alligator and a sword-wielding conquistador. And upon returning back to his present, Steve decides to record himself so he can show a future audience precisely what the drug is capable of, and he started explaining what happened to him, and his intention is to continue taking the pill to try and find Dennis's daughter, Brianna. And the location in which you take the drug impacts which time period you get sent back to. When Steve takes it on the couch, he goes back to an early European settlement in Louisiana. However, when he takes it while standing up in his living room, it sends him back to the Neanderthal times. And Steve also realizes that the objects that you hold on to as you go back and forth through time travel stay with you. And the woman who was burned alive at the abandoned theme park held onto a doorknob, and that was with her at the crime scene. And with his knowledge, Steve tries to determine whether he can bring back live objects back with him. And all of this is so he can determine if he can simply hold Brianna to bring her back to his timeline. And he goes through with this experiment with his dog, Hawking. He hugs his dog very tightly, bringing them both into the past, except this time, they've gone back to the most treacherous time possible for Steve. This time travel to the recent past was at Steve's house, which was still standing, but the only problem is that somebody else is occupying the house, and they don't take too kindly to seeing Steve there. And Steve and Hawking make a run for it when the homeowner pulls out a gun, and that's the point where Steve discovers something else about the pill. 7 minutes pass and Steve and his dog haven't returned to the present, and he realizes that he has to be in the same location where he took the Synchronic in order to leap back to his own time period. And Steve waits until night comes before heading back inside the house so he and Hawking can sit on the couch again, and he takes another pill and he heads inside. And the only problem is that he's apparently didn't wait long enough because the homeowner returns and sees Steve and Hawking sitting there, and they get into a tussle as Steve begins to fade back to the present, but Hawking is at the front door away from Steve. And when Steve returns to the present, he sees a ghost of Hawking there momentarily until he fades out of the present. And sadly, Hawking is now trapped in the past since he wasn't touching Steve during the jump. And there aren't enough pills for Steve to go back to try to get Hawking back and also rescue Brianna. So Hawking is now stuck in another time period forever. So to sum it all up, his experiments teach him that the exact place you take the drug determines the time that you go back to, and you also have exactly 7 minutes in the past, and you can't be late for your return, and you have to be touching someone if you want to bring them back to the present timeline. And he takes another Synchronic pill where Brianna disappeared, and he discovers several tribal men who chase him up a tree. And he did not find Brianna there, and he later learned from one of Brianna's friends that she might have just wandered off before taking the Synchronic. And he also realizes that touching objects can also anchor someone to that object's time period. And at this point, Steve only has about 2 Synchronic pills left to find Brianna, but he doesn't know the exact location where she was when she disappeared. So Steve talks to Dennis at this bar, and Dennis, who's taken his life for granted, believes that he's headed to a divorce. And Steve tells Dennis about his cancer, and the two reconcile, and at the graveyard of Steve's family, Steve shows Dennis the video of his time travel. And after a series of trial and error, Steve realizes where he needs to go in order to find Brianna. In an earlier scene, Steve and Brianna talk on a boulder in a park during her little sister's birthday party, and the boulder notably had "always" carved into it. And after explaining his experiments to Dennis, Steve thinks that Brianna may have carved it in the past as a message to the two of them. And Steve then sits on the rock and takes the pill, and he finds himself in the battlefields of the American Civil War of 1812. With fires raging and cannons exploding, he gets shot in the leg while searching for Brianna, and he finds her in a trench filled with dead bodies, and she's not harmed at all. He's confused as to how Steve found her, and he tells her that he found her message on the boulder, and she tells him that she has no clue what he's talking about, meaning she didn't carve the "always" symbol on the boulder. And Steve gives Brianna his final pill and leads her to where she needs to be for the jump to work properly. But things don't really go smoothly when they learn that they're not alone amongst the flames, and a man appears pointing a gun at Steve, believing Steve to be a runaway slave, and he threatens to kill them both. He gets Steve to walk forward with his hands up in the air, but Steve doesn't want to get too far away from the rock that he needs to be at. And Steve distracts the looter as the time of the leap comes and passes, and Brianna manages to get back to her present, and she finally gives a hug to her father. And the looter accidentally steps on a landmine after being startled by an explosion, and Steve realizes while sitting on the boulder that he's the one that carved the message on the boulder. And when Dennis and Brianna turn around to see a ghostly version of Steve sitting on the boulder in present day, Steve and Dennis shake hands before Steve fades away into oblivion. And Steve is now stuck in the past, just like his dog, using whatever kind of time he has left to help his best friend be reunited with his family once more. And he's accomplished his mission really well. And that is how the movie comes to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed our recap. Remember to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.